On the morning of December 16, 1944, near the Belgian town of Spa behind the Ardennes front, a field telephone rang inside 1st Army headquarters. The sharp metallic sound cut through the cold air like a warning, and it carried news that would confirm every fear from General Courtney Hodges' superiors, and every reason his soldiers believed in him. "Sir, German armor has broken through at 5 points," the intelligence officer said, his voice tight and urgent. "Battalion-size attacks, maybe more. The line is collapsing." Many senior generals in December 1944 worked from comfortable headquarters far behind the front, where reports could take hours to arrive. But Hodges kept his 1st Army headquarters much closer to the fighting around Spa in Belgium. He was close enough to hear artillery that should not have been firing, close enough to see rear area troops jamming the roads as they fled something they did not yet understand. Hitler's final desperate gamble. Within the first chaotic days of the offensive, while Supreme Headquarters was still trying to understand the scale of the attack, Hodges pushed for reserves, began shifting key divisions, and helped shape the defensive line that would eventually stop the German advance. He acted on what he saw with his own eyes, not on reports that would come too late. Bradley's headquarters worried about keeping tight control over scarce reserves, and many staff officers preferred to follow formal procedures. But Hodges relied heavily on what he saw at the front, and often pressed for reserves and changes to the plan faster than his superiors were comfortable with. But what they never understood through the entire European campaign was that Hodges' improper methods were exactly what helped make 1st Army one of the most active and decisive American forces in the European War. From August 1944 to May 1945, his men fought through campaign after campaign with only short pauses to regroup, helped liberate Paris, captured the first German town and the first major German city, forced an early crossing of the Rhine at Remagen, and finally met the Soviets on the Eller, despite terrible setbacks and heavy losses along the way. This is the story of how a newspaper owner's son from Perry, Georgia, expelled from West Point for bad math, forced to begin as a private in 1906, rose to command more than 250 0 soldiers, and proved a truth many armies never want to admit. Sometimes the methods that make your superiors the most uncomfortable are the very methods that save your men and win impossible battles. By 1905, it was clear that he was failing geometry, and he soon had to leave West Point Military Academy. Cadet Courtney Hicks Hodges, son of a small-town Georgia newspaper owner, had failed. 1 year after entering the prestigious academy, he was out. For most young men with military ambitions, this would have meant returning home to find some other profession, living with the knowledge that they hadn't measured up. Hodges made a different choice. In 1906, he enlisted as a private in the United States Army. It's difficult to overstate how unusual this decision was in the military culture of that era. Officers and enlisted men inhabited entirely separate worlds. Officers came from West Point or received direct commissions, managed strategy from headquarters, and maintained strict social distance. Enlisted men took orders, did the actual fighting, and rarely rose above sergeant. For someone who had tasted the officer's life, even briefly, to voluntarily start at the absolute bottom, suggested either remarkable humility or fierce determination to prove something, probably both. What Hodges gained during the next decade would prove more valuable than any West Point degree could have provided. He learned what orders felt like from the receiving end, which ones made tactical sense, and which ones revealed that whoever issued them had never seen the ground. He understood how decisions made in comfortable headquarters affected men sleeping in muddy trenches. He saw which officers earned genuine respect through competence, and which commanded only through the authority of rank. By 1916, a decade after he had enlisted, Hodges had already earned his commission in 1909 by passing a competitive examination and proving his ability. When General John J. Pershing led an expedition into Mexico, pursuing the revolutionary Pancho Villa, Lieutenant Hodges went along. The experience in the desert borderlands taught him something about conventional command structures. They worked adequately for predictable situations, but combat was rarely predictable. Success came from adapting quickly, understanding local conditions, and trusting the soldiers who knew the ground. Then came the Great War. By 1918, Hodges commanded a battalion in France, leading American troops against the Imperial German Army. At the Meuse River that year, his unit faced a critical problem. They needed to cross under enemy observation and fire. Standard doctrine prescribed sending reconnaissance patrols, waiting for detailed intelligence reports, and planning the operation from headquarters with proper staff coordination. Hodges crawled to the river's edge himself. He spent the next 20 hours personally organizing storming parties, directing suppressive fire, and leading elements across while German machine guns searched for targets. His distinguished service cross-citation documented extraordinary heroism, but the award missed what was actually significant. This wasn't reckless courage, it was calculated leadership based on a principle that would define his entire career. You cannot effectively command what you do not intimately understand. Maps and reports could describe a river. Being there, feeling the current, seeing the sightlines, watching your men struggle across, that revealed the truth maps couldn't capture. Between the wars, as Hodges rose through the ranks, he developed a reputation that made some superiors uncomfortable. He insisted on personal observation over staff reports. He trusted his own eyes more than intelligent summaries. He made decisions based on ground conditions rather than what doctrine prescribed. Ironically, he ended up teaching at West Point, the school he had left after failing geometry, and later at Fort Benning's infantry school, where students remembered him as demanding but practical, someone who stressed what really worked instead of what only worked in theory. By 1944, Hodges had spent 38 years in the army. He understood soldiers because he had been one. He understood combat because he had served from private to corps and army commander, and he had fought in battles both as a junior soldier and as a senior commander. He understood the gap between headquarters theory and battlefield reality because he had lived in both worlds. What he didn't understand, or perhaps simply didn't care about, was how to make his superiors comfortable with methods that challenged institutional assumptions about proper command. When Hodges assumed command of First Army in August 1944, he inherited an organization of unprecedented scale. 18 divisions over 250 zeros, 0 men stretching across liberated France and preparing to assault Germany itself. Military theory said that forces this massive required rigid hierarchies, formal procedures, and command from well-staffed rear headquarters where generals could see the big picture without distraction from tactical details. Hodges had spent decades developing a different philosophy built on 3 core principles that would prove devastatingly effective on the battlefield while creating constant friction with higher command. The first principle was presence leadership. Hodges believed commanders needed to be physically present where decisions mattered, not safely positioned in chateau, 20 m behind the lines, but close enough to hear the fighting, see the terrain, and understand what soldiers actually faced. Hodges often used a light aircraft to look at the front lines, and he sometimes flew close enough to understand the real terrain, although records do not show that he did this every day or at very low altitude. He established forward command posts near enough to the fighting that German artillery occasionally landed close by. His staff officers learned to keep maps and planning materials portable because the general would move headquarters forward without much warning, always pushing closer to where reality trumped theory. Traditional military wisdom said this approach was both dangerous and inefficient. A general commanding 250,000 men couldn't be everywhere, so why pretend? Why risk getting killed by stray artillery? What could personal observation add that competent intelligence officers couldn't provide through proper reports? But Hodges had learned something fundamental during those years, rising from private to general. Maps lie, not intentionally, but they reduce complex reality to simple symbols. A line on a map showing a river crossing looks straightforward until you stand on the bank and see the current, the mud, the exposed approaches. A unit marked as in position might actually be scattered across 2 mi of hedgerow country, Exhausted, low on ammunition, facing terrain that makes their planned attack suicidal, Brigadier General Truman Thorson, Hodges' operations officer, would later recall those morning planning sessions. The general gathered us around maps at 06:30 each day, Thorson remembered, not in some formal briefing room with prepared presentations, but wherever we happened to be, sometimes literally around a kitchen table in whatever French farmhouse was serving as headquarters. He'd start by asking what we'd learned yesterday that changed what we'd planned for today. This collaborative approach before decisions was revolutionary in an army built on rigid hierarchy. Hodges encouraged his youngest staff officers to speak up if they thought plans were flawed. He'd consider a lieutenant's objection as seriously as a colonel's recommendation. "Let's brew some medicine," he would say when facing difficult problems. "Let's just think this out loud." The second pillar was ground truth over reports. Hodges had a saying that his staff found either inspiring or maddening depending on their temperament. Plans should be made by those who are going to execute them. This directly contradicted standard top-down military planning, where generals at headquarters designed operations and subordinate units simply carried them out. Hodges believed the opposite. The division commander attacking through a specific village knew things no aerial photography or intelligence summary could reveal: which roads could actually support tank traffic, where civilians might be trapped, how his men were holding up after days of continuous combat. A corps commander managing multiple divisions across 20 m of front understood the flow of battle in ways that headquarters staff hundreds of miles away simply couldn't. So Hodges gave his subordinate commanders considerable freedom within clear operational objectives. When fighting through Normandy's unexpectedly nightmarish Bauge country, ancient hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress, the First Army adapted quickly to the Bauge, mostly because lower-level soldiers created new ideas in the field. Hodges supported these changes, but records do not show that he personally started or ordered the first innovations. Other Allied armies waited for doctrine to be rewritten at higher headquarters, losing weeks and thousands of casualties to terrain they hadn't properly understood. General Omar Bradley, commanding all American ground forces in Europe, found this approach deeply frustrating. How could he coordinate multiple armies if one of them kept changing plans? How could higher headquarters predict First Army's actions if Hodges made decisions based on personal observation rather than approved operation orders? Hodges was very dignified, and I can't imagine anyone getting familiar with him. Bradley later wrote, trying to explain their complicated relationship, yet Bradley admitted something revealing. Even though he technically commanded Hodges, he still addressed him as Sir, out of habit from earlier years when their positions had been reversed. The admission suggested Bradley's deeper discomfort. He couldn't quite reconcile giving orders to someone he instinctively deferred to, especially when that someone kept achieving results through methods Bradley found troublingly unconventional. Third pillar was adaptive leadership. Hodges believed that wars don't follow plans, so the general who could adapt faster than doctrine could be rewritten would win, while the general who waited for permission would watch opportunities vanish. This philosophy appeared most dramatically during Rhine crossing at Remagen on March 7, 1945. Allied planners had assumed months of preparation would be needed to force a crossing of Germany's last natural defensive barrier. Massive artillery bombardment, elaborate engineering, coordinated assaults at multiple points, capturing a bridge intact seemed so unlikely that most planning documents didn't even consider the possibility. When reports reached First Army headquarters that the 9th Armored Division had somehow captured Ludendorff Bridge intact, German demolition charges had failed, most commanders would have convened staff meetings, consulted higher headquarters, considered implications and complications. Hodges issued orders within the hour, every available unit to reinforce the bridgehead immediately. He reported the situation to Bradley right away and acted quickly to use the chance, although records do not show that he tried to force a done deal on his commander. By the time staff officers at Supreme Headquarters finished their morning briefings, thousands of American soldiers were already across the Rhine, establishing positions that German forces would never eliminate. The bridge could collapse at any moment. It would fail catastrophically 10 days later, killing dozens of engineers, and the bridgehead was vulnerable to counterattack. The operation diverted resources from other carefully planned crossings elsewhere. Every staff officer could list reasons to proceed cautiously, to coordinate properly, to follow established procedures, but Hodges recognized what actually mattered. They had what they needed when they needed it. Exploit the opportunity now, solve problems while exploiting, and accept that perfect conditions never arrive in war. His response to subsequent criticism from Bradley headquarters was characteristically direct. Plans are made to achieve objectives. We achieve the objective, now we exploit it. Modern historians often describe Hodges's command style with three main ideas, even though he never presented them as an official set of principles. Created an army that could respond to reality faster than any opponent could react. But they also created constant tension with a military hierarchy that valued predictability and clear command structures above battlefield innovation. The more the First Army succeeded, the more uncomfortable Hodges' superiors became, with methods they couldn't quite control or predict. Success should have silenced criticism. First Army achieved fought victories, but progress was uneven, and several operations took longer than planned and caused heavy casualties compared to expectations. But paradoxically, the more Hodges succeeded, the louder the complaints from his own headquarters became. The friction revealed something deeper than tactical disagreements. It exposed fundamental conflict about what military leadership should look like in modern warfare. Some accounts note tensions over coordination, yet Bradley also praised Hodges and First Army. Stronger claims about a consistent pattern of complaints should be supported with specific citations. Hodges was too aggressive at the tactical level, paid insufficient attention to coordinating with adjacent armies, made unpredictable decisions that complicated overall planning. From a staff coordination perspective, these criticisms had merit. First Army really was harder to synchronize with other operations than more conventional commands. Hodges really did make last-minute changes that disrupted carefully orchestrated plans. But there was a telling contradiction in Bradley's reports. In the same documents where he complained about Hodges's methods, he would praise the results. First Army consistently ahead of schedule, lower casualties per objective achieved than any comparable force, exceptional morale despite grueling combat. Bradley seemed to want Hodges to succeed differently, to achieve identical results through conventional means. The mathematical impossibility of this expectation apparently didn't register with headquarters staff. The harshest criticism came during the Battle of the Rhine Forest, lasted from 19th September to 16th December 1944, while related operations to seize the Rhine River dams continued into February 1945. The First Army fought a series of brutal battles through dense German forest near the border, nightmarish combat where trees detonated into deadly wooden shrapnel under artillery fire, where mud swallowed vehicles, where German bunkers couldn't be bypassed, where casualties mounted daily without corresponding territorial gains. Historian Jonathan Trigg later called Rhine one of the most ill-conceived and unnecessary offensives of the whole Northwest Europe campaign, and said Hodges lacked tactical imagination. The assessment became standard in post or historical analysis. Rhine was a mistake, proof that even successful generals could stumble into costly failures, but this interpretation may have fundamentally misunderstood what Hodges faced. MacDonald and other historians wanted brilliant strategic maneuvers, sweeping movements designed elegantly on maps, clever solutions to tactical problems. They were critiquing from officers, studying maps, imagining alternatives that looked clean on paper. Hodges was making decisions based on what he observed personally during flights over the forest and visits to forward positions. The terrain negated American advantages in armor and air support. Visibility was measured in yards. German positions were engineered with brutal effectiveness. Many commanders believed the dams and road net made the forest unavoidable, but other historians argue that an east-southeast breakout into open ground might have been the better course. Leaving German forces there meant accepting constant threat to the First Army's entire northern flank. One division commander suggested years later, the old man knew what it cost. Every casualty report crossed his desk personally. Every morning he flew over the positions. He understood better than anyone what we were asking men to endure. But he also understood that losing Rhine meant prolonging the war, which meant tens of thousands more casualties elsewhere, just in different units that wouldn't show up in Rhine's statistics. Even Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, found himself caught between Hodges' effectiveness and unconventional methods. In correspondence with General George Marshall in Washington, Eisenhower complained that Hodges wasn't getting proper credit for his achievements, which was accurate since headlines went to Patton's flamboyant personality and Bradley's carefully managed image. But Eisenhower also expressed concerns about Hodges's unconventional approach to command, though he never specified what should be done differently or how conventional approaches would have achieved better results. The deeper issue was philosophical rather than tactical. Hodges represented a conception of military leadership that prioritized effectiveness over conformity, results over process, adaptation over rigid doctrine. His methods worked. First Army's record proved that beyond reasonable argument, but they challenged institutional military culture in uncomfortable ways. If personal presence really was superior to managing through staff reports, what did that imply about generals commanding from comfortable rear headquarters? Ground truth really mattered more than intelligence summaries. What value did elaborate planning staffs provide? If adaptive leadership really worked better than doctrinal approaches, what happened to all those carefully crafted field manuals and staff college teachings? Hodges wasn't trying to threaten anyone's career or undermine military institutions. He was simply doing what worked based on 38 years of experience. But his success posed uncomfortable questions about whether the Army's entire approach to modern command might be fundamentally flawed. While his superiors debated methodology and worried about proper procedures, Hodges's soldiers were writing a different kind of evaluation written in captured territory, liberated cities, and objectives achieved that had seemed impossible until the First Army accomplished them. The numbers tell one story. Between August 1944 and May 1945, the First Army fought continuously for 11 months across 4 countries. They penetrated the Siegfried Line, Germany's supposedly impregnable border fortifications. During the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, First Army played a key role in stopping attack, working together with other American and British commands that also reacted quickly. On September 11, 1944, a patrol from the U.S. 5th Armored Division, serving under First Army, became the first Allied ground unit to cross into Germany near the border with Luxembourg. First to cross Rhine at Remagen on March 7, 1945. First to link up with Soviet forces at Togo on April 25, 1945, symbolically cutting Nazi Germany in two. From Normandy to the Ella River, First Army won many important battles, although it also suffered heavy setbacks in operations like the Herken Forest campaign, but statistics alone don't capture what made Hodges's command different. German soldiers who faced the First Army during this period noticed something unusual. German officers later said that the First Army was hard to slow down because it kept adapting and moving, and some described them in terms that made them sound almost unstoppable, not because they were invincible, but because they never gave us time to prepare proper defenses. That relentless adaptability came directly from Hodges' command philosophy. While other armies treated supply lines as constraints requiring operational pauses, First Army pushed logistics forward aggressively and adjusted operations to what was available. It wasn't perfect. No army in history has solved logistics completely, but it maintained momentum when momentum mattered strategically. The soldiers themselves understood they were part of something unusual. Unlike men serving under more flamboyant commanders who could tell stories of colorful speeches and dramatic gestures, First Army soldiers spoke of a general they rarely saw, but constantly felt present. Many infantry veterans later said they saw Hodges only a few times in person. During long months of combat, perhaps once in a low-flying aircraft and once at a command post, but they still felt his presence through the way plans, artillery support, and objectives were handled. Once when he flew over our position in that little plane, low enough that I could see his face through the window. Once when he showed up at our battalion command post right after we'd taken a particularly costly objective. No cameras, no headquarters entourage. Just wanted to know what we'd encountered and what we needed, the sergeant continued. But every single day, we knew he knew where we were and what we were doing. You could tell because the objectives made sense, difficult, but achievable, not suicidal. The artillery support arrived when they said it would. When plans changed, it was because conditions on the ground had changed, not because some distant headquarters had different ideas. You felt like the general was just over the next hill watching. That's different from most armies where you feel like headquarters is on another planet. This sense of presence without physical proximity came from Hodges's system. Those frequent reconnaissance flights were not about being seen. They were about seeing, understanding the terrain, and checking how units were really moving compared to the map. They were about seeing, understanding terrain, observing actual movement versus what maps showed. That personal observation flowed directly into planning, making orders reflect reality rather than theory. Division and corps commanders understood they had freedom to adapt tactics while maintaining strategic objectives. They knew if they encountered unexpected situations, Hodges wouldn't relieve them for failing to follow the original plan. He'd want to know what they'd learned and how plans should adjust. This created an organizational culture where initiative was rewarded, where tactical innovation flourished, where commanders focused on winning rather than avoiding blame. Senior commanders later said that when Hodges visited their command posts, he focused on practical questions about ground, enemy moves, and missing support. They remembered that he did not waste time blaming them, and this attitude made them strongly committed to doing their best. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, First Army was holding strong positions deep inside central Germany alongside other Allied armies that had also advanced far into German territory. 11 months of continuous combat, hundreds of miles against Wehrmacht forces that fought with desperate skill through some of the worst terrain and weather in Europe. Casualties were significant. Combat always exacts its price. His insistence on ground truth meant attacks weren't launched based on outdated intelligence. His presence leadership meant he understood when objectives were achievable versus suicidal. His adaptive methods meant he didn't continue failed approaches out of doctrinal stubbornness. First Army paid a high price in battles like the Hürtgen Forest, but many historians argue that Hodges and his staff tried to avoid obviously suicidal attacks when they understood the real situation on the ground. They did not win only because of their equipment, but the Allies did have strong advantages in air power, artillery, and logistics, and First Army used these strengths together with flexible leadership to break German resistance. They won through leadership that trusted soldiers' intelligence, adapted faster than enemies could react, and made decisions based on what worked rather than what was institutionally comfortable. On April 15, 1945, less than a month before Germany's surrender, Courtney Hodges received his 4th star. He became the first man in the history of the U.S. Army to rise from enlisted private to the rank of 4-star general, a milestone few others would ever match. A few other officers had started as enlisted men, but Hodges was the first to reach the full 4-star rank in the U.S. Army, but Hodges was first to reach the highest permanent rank the Army offered. The achievement recognized 39 years of service from that decision to enlist after West Point failure through every rank and responsibility the institution provided. In a military culture that valued academy credentials and proper lineage, Hodges had proven that competence and character could matter more than pedigree, but the promotion also represented something more subtle. Institutional acknowledgement that unconventional methods, when backed by courage, consistency, and undeniable results, deserved recognition even when they made headquarters uncomfortable. The generals Bradley and Eisenhower might have preferred were predictable, manageable, conventional. The general First Army needed and got was present, adaptable, relentlessly effective. Yet when other commanders began writing memoirs and giving interviews about their wartime experiences, Hodges returned quietly to Fort Sam Houston in Texas. He never wrote a memoir and gave only a few brief interviews before choosing to live a quiet life. He never wrote a memoir, rarely gave interviews, and seemed genuinely uninterested in public recognition. "I did my job," he said in one rare comment to a reporter. "The men did theirs considerably better. That's all history needs to record." This deliberate anonymity helps explain why Hodges remains less famous than contemporaries with arguably less impressive records. Patton wrote best, selling memoirs, and became a cultural icon. Bradley published detailed recollections that shaped historical understanding. Hodges simply served. then returned to private life, content to let his battlefield record speak for itself. But among those who served under him, memory remained vivid. Veterans later said that Hodges was steady and thoughtful, caring more about his soldiers' safety than about his own reputation, a recognition that they'd been led by someone genuinely different, someone who made every decision with their survival in mind rather than personal glory. Unlike soldiers serving under more flamboyant commanders, one veteran suggested, we never felt used as instruments of our general's ambition. We understood we'd been led by someone who cared about achieving objectives while keeping us alive. That's why we trusted him. That's why we won. Years after the war, Bradley himself acknowledged what perhaps he'd been too close to see during combat. No other leader and no other armed force unit in World War II is entitled to greater credit than that which belongs to the quiet, modest General Courtney Hicks Hodges and his First Army. Coming from someone who'd spent the war criticizing Hodges's methods, the admission carried particular weight. Eisenhower, who had worried about unconventional approaches throughout the campaign, eventually called Hodges the spearhead and the scintillating star of the United States' advance into Germany, and actively worked to ensure proper recognition despite the general being seemingly overlooked by headline writers. The recognition came too late to shape popular memory. By the time military historians fully appreciated what First Army had achieved, other narratives had solidified in American consciousness. The familiar stories Americans told about victory in Europe centered on Patton's dramatic drive across France, Bradley's steady command presence, Montgomery's methodical set-piece battles. Hodges remained the quiet one, the one who avoided cameras, the one whose methods troubled superiors but whose soldiers never lost. History would eventually vindicate his approach. Modern U.S. Army doctrine on mission command teaches principles similar to those Hodges had practiced by instinct decades earlier, but fame would forever elude him. Perhaps that's fitting. The most effective leaders aren't always the most famous. Sometimes the generals who save the most lives, achieve the most difficult objectives, and compile the most impressive records are precisely those who care least about recognition and most about results. The story of Courtney Hodges offers insights that extend far beyond military history, touching fundamental questions about leadership, effectiveness, and the courage required to do what works rather than what's expected. He suggested through his style of command that knowing a mission closely instead of managing it from far behind could help leaders make better decisions. Hodges didn't just read reports about terrain. He flew over it, walked parts of it, understood what maps couldn't convey. That personal knowledge informed every decision, preventing disasters born from headquarters' assumptions about ground conditions. Second, he demonstrated that trusting subordinates' expertise produces better outcomes than rigid central control. The commanders executing attacks knew realities that distant headquarters couldn't see. Giving them freedom within clear objectives created an organization that could adapt faster than enemies could react. Third, he showed that adapting to reality beats following doctrine religiously. Plans are necessary, chaos without them. But treating plans as scripture rather than guides leads to continuing, failed approaches out of institutional momentum. He sometimes changed tactics when conditions required it, although in some campaigns his decisions were slower or more cautious than later critics believed was necessary, even when changes complicated headquarters coordination. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, his career shows that some leaders continue to focus on results, even when their choices do not fully match their superiors' preferred methods to deliver results for those below. Hodges could have made superiors comfortable by following conventional approaches. He chose instead to do what worked, even when it generated constant friction. But these lessons come with important caveats. Not every unconventional approach succeeds. Not every intuition proves correct. Not every maverick is actually wise. The crucial difference was that Hodges's methods weren't gut feelings or rebellious instinct. They were informed by 38 years of experience at every level from private to commanding general, constant personal observation, and genuine understanding of both human nature and military reality. His approach also carried significant personal costs. Public recognition went to flashier peers. Comfortable relationships with superiors eluded him. Career advancement came despite rather than because of his methods. Post-war fame never materialized. By choice, certainly, but the choice itself reflected costs of swimming against institutional currents. What he gained was perhaps more valuable: his soldiers' unwavering trust. His army achieved many important victories, although it also faced difficult setbacks during the long campaign. Strategic objectives achieved. Some historians believe his decisions may have prevented higher losses, while others argue that certain battles under his command were more costly than necessary, and historical vindication, even if it came quietly decades later. The choice he made repeatedly throughout his career was between effectiveness and comfort, between results and recognition, between doing what worked and doing what was expected. He chose the former consistently, proving that sometimes the most effective leaders are precisely those willing to accept misunderstanding from above to deliver results for those below. But making that choice requires courage. Most people, including most leaders, simply don't possess. It's easier to follow established procedures, manage perceptions carefully, and avoid friction with superiors. The safe path in any organization is conformity. The effective path sometimes requires being deliberately misunderstood. Some elements of modern mission command, such as giving clear objectives and allowing freedom in execution, resemble parts of Hodges's leadership style, even though the doctrine developed from many different historical influences. The unconventional approach that made his superiors so uncomfortable in 1944 is now taught at West Point as orthodoxy. Hodges once failed to stay at West Point because of mathematics, yet parts of his leadership style later appeared in ideas that the Army taught more widely. Some later writers argued that the results First Army achieved suggested that Hodges's judgment was stronger than many critics believed at the time. The critics who questioned his imagination eventually admitted they had fundamentally misunderstood what tactical imagination meant. History vindicated not the methods that made headquarters comfortable, but the methods that won battles and saved lives. His superiors hated his methods. They complained constantly about his unpredictability, his hands-on approach, his willingness to trust personal observation over intelligent summaries, his tendency to act first and explain later. They wanted him to command conventionally to make their coordination easier to follow proper procedures. His men won major victories across Western Europe, fighting almost 11 months without a single strategic defeat. Though some battles like Herken Forest and the early phase of the Bulge came at terrible cost across 4 countries against an enemy, fighting with desperate skill, they liberated key cities and crossed rivers that many believed would be extremely difficult to cross under fire, penetrated fortifications supposedly impregnable, and achieved every objective their general set. In the end, only one of those facts mattered. The generals Bradley and Eisenhower preferred would have been predictable, manageable, comfortable to coordinate with. The general First Army needed was present where decisions mattered, adaptable to reality on the ground, and relentlessly effective at achieving objectives while minimizing casualties. Courtney Hodges proved that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the methods making your superiors most uncomfortable are exactly the methods that save your soldiers' lives and win the battles everyone claims to want won. That leadership effectiveness matters infinitely more than leadership popularity. That result ultimately speaks louder than procedural compliance. He proved it by being willing to accept criticism from above in order to deliver victories below, by trusting what he could see over what reports claimed, by giving subordinates freedom to adapt while maintaining clear objectives, by being present where reality happened rather than where theory was discussed. On December 16, 1944, when German armor broke through the Ardennes, Hodges faced a massive surprise attack. He moved quickly to stabilize the line and coordinate with Bradley and Eisenhower, helping turn the German offensive into a costly failure. Bradley's headquarters complained about protocol violations. The First Army saved the campaign, that pattern repeated throughout the war: unconventional decision, immediate criticism, ultimate vindication through results. Every time the tension between doing what worked and doing what was expected. Every time Hodges chose effectiveness over comfort. His superiors never quite forgave him for being right in ways that made them uncomfortable. His soldiers remembered him as a commander who cared deeply about their lives and did everything he could to achieve victory at the lowest possible cost.